first time I ever saw a Bigfoot. I was a young man, just having graduated from high school, and I decided to spend my summer exploring some of the backcountry, taking in all nature had to offer me. One particular afternoon, I found myself wandering through a very dense section of vegetation of forest that ran alongside a river. It was there that my own eyes locked on with a creature of unlike anything I had ever seen. Truth be told, upon seeing this thing for the first time, as it was something I had never seen in my life, I felt the drive to run, and at the same time, I was shocked by what I was seeing and looking at. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life. I hadn't seen it yet, and was crouched on the other side of the river, drinking water, the exact same way a person would with their hand, cupping it and sipping water. My first thought was this was some sort of large indigenous person drinking water, until it looked up at me. Instantly, I realized this was no human, even though it kind of reminded me of a Neanderthal. Its face, though, had black eyes. It immediately stood up, turned around, and walked off. As it did, it kind of had this expression on its face like it was scoffing at me in annoyance. Or so that's how I interpret it. I was in shock at this, and returned back home immediately. Of course, I never could tell anybody what I saw. Nobody would believe me. Later on, I found friends and connections that were very into Bigfoot, where I got to share my actual encounter. What's interesting is Bigfoot is usually supposed to be reported as pretty big. This wasn't. It was probably about the same height I was, about 6 feet tall. I'm guessing it wasn't fully grown. I know this is all very difficult to believe, especially since I don't have any evidence or pictures. But it's what happened the day when I approached this thing in the river, in the forest, near my house. Only those who have actually witnessed these things even know how they walk and act, so they could probably understand. Sometimes there's no doubt you'll know them if they're there. They hide pretty well, but for whatever reason, this one didn't mind keeping itself out in the open. I wondered if I had maybe just startled it, and that's why it was annoyed. Either way, take my word for it. Bigfoot are real. It was either late 1976 or early 1977, when not quite 15 years old, me and my friend Kurt were riding our bikes from a fishing trip on the White River, 6 miles east of Cascade, Arkansas. It seemed much longer than that unpleasant trip, as Kurt and I were stopped at a creek crossing, when we see something moving like a tall man in the woods, right along this divided road from the river. The thing was quite dark brownish, very black too, hairy, having big muscles with long arms and legs. It looked up at us and decided to throw some mud over in our direction, along with some rocks. Kurt even mentioned that it growled, but I didn't hear anything. I just see it reach down and grab some mud and rocks, and throw it off in our direction, then bang something large like a piece of wood against the tree trunk. We jumped on our bikes and took off riding hard for home. As soon as we get there, we told everybody about what had happened. No one really believed us. Sometime after that event, though, my mother's sister or my aunt called to tell her that she'd seen one of them in the woods near the house. She would not or could not describe it to my mother, who dismissed her talking about such nonsense as a childish imagination, or simply a misidentification of a bear. But now, I wonder if Kurt and I were seeing a female picking mites out from under her arms, or maybe someone stumbling upon her after emerging from the river. For years, I never thought about what we saw that evening, but one day, in 2001, I saw an Animal Planet special on Bigfoot. They showed actors' depictions of what this creature might look like using CGI and how it behaved. This was strange because when I first saw the thing, it was running away from us into the woods, directly across where we were standing with our bikes. So, based on its direction of travel and the location where we were at, I could get a based on my estimation. If we were within 30 to 40 yards closer to this thing, we would no doubt have been too close for comfort. We could see that it was very hairy. Like many people have seen Bigfoot, I can assure you that its appearance is nothing like any man or woman of this planet. This creature is much more powerful and has different behavior than any animal found in the wild. The only way to describe what we would have saw is something akin to a Neanderthal with long arms and legs. My encounter was a little bit different from most Bigfoot sightings. When I saw this thing, it didn't seem to be so aggressive. I want to tell my story about seeing Bigfoot. This way, maybe I could help educate others on what they look like, so more people will believe that these actually exist and are out there somewhere, since many people still consider us crazy for really believing they exist. And if nothing else, maybe somebody could figure out why some of us have seen them, but know that not everybody who claims to see them is lying. It was early fall of 1989, and my buddies and I were camping at the river near the hot springs in Northern California. I was pretty young, 13 and going into 8th grade, so I was still a kid at heart. Now, I was a pretty naughty kid, because with my friends, we had snuck alcohol and also cigarettes, which we were indulging in quite a bit. We weren't really concerned about anything else but having fun, since our families were all back home, miles away from where we were camping. We didn't have to worry about getting busted. During our stay there, we began hearing what sounded like heavy footsteps walking through the trees behind us and around the river. This was later on at night, so we just chalked it up to maybe some drunk hillbillies out there or something. It freaked us out, but we thought we had safety in numbers. After hearing it walk behind us for a while, we decided to try and talk to them, since we thought it was funny. We yelled out things and talked smack to them. We were pretty entertained in our inebriated state, but whatever. The sound ceased. It turned out that nobody was there, but it sounded like footsteps coming closer and closer. Even branches and stuff were being broken. That's when we began to feel more and more unsafe. We had our flashlights with us, of course, but by the time everybody in our camp had already ran inside their tents and set them up tight, nobody really used them. I remember that night like it happened yesterday. Looking up from the bottom of my sleeping bag with my tent open and still hearing the noises. Then, I see something big looking down at me. I don't remember if it was standing up or sitting down, but I remember this ugly, hairy face, almost like it had been shaved or something. It was strange looking. Its eyes were huge. I could see them very clearly, off the slow glow of what was ever left of the burning embers in the distance. They looked like big black marbles, just as the light reflected off of them, looking into me. I shined my flashlight up at this thing's face. It looked like a real living nightmare. I could feel it looking at me, and for some reason, this just terrified me. All of a sudden, this thing began to make this groaning noise, like it was starting to move. Maybe it didn't realize that I was looking back at it, so I ducked inside my sleeping bag, completely petrified this thing was going to get me. I could barely breathe and had tears running down my face, while my friends in the distance, all scared, had no idea this was going on. I think they were still cracking jokes. I was trying not to make a sound because it felt like this thing was really there with me inside the tent. And after what seemed like an eternity, I could hear it walk away from my tent and off into the woods. I began yelling at everybody to get up, to pack their stuff. We needed to leave right now, regardless of whether they wanted to or not. Nobody budged, and they fought against it, considering a lot of them were still drunk, and we were all 13 and 14. None of us wanted that talking to from our parents. I didn't care, though. I sat alone in my tent, sobbing for about 15 minutes, before packing everything up myself and just walking back home to the trail that led out to the forest, even though it was roughly 1 in the morning. I didn't care. I have not story, though. This is the first time I've ever really told anybody else, other than some family members and close friends. Oh, and one last thing. You might think I'm crazy for walking out there at night by myself, but you don't understand. I was so scared, I didn't care. I just was desperate to get away from whatever this large creature was. At the time, I just understood it to be a monster, or something I did not quite understand. I hunted with my uncle. He likes to call it hunting. To me, it's sitting and drinking beer until you get bored. We started at 8 a.m., drove 20 miles to the river without any luck. Afterwards, we sat in the truck for 4 hours with him, looking through binoculars while he had a few beers. He would look up every once in a while and scan back down towards his drink, or whatever bottle of poison he was hiding from his wife. Then, we heard something. I've never been one to believe in Bigfoot, but after hearing the strange sound, running into some very strange people, and finally seeing what I saw, let's just say I'm not so sure anymore what I believe. It was coming from behind the trees behind us. There was a large barbed wire fence. There were also no game trails down there. I looked over at my uncle, and he said, "Somebody must be hunting here." He gets out, walked back around his truck. Now remember, I'm a city boy for the most part. Born and raised, so this next part is very hard for me to admit, but I'll tell you what happened, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you believe me. We ran through the grass, climbing over the barbed wire fence, and getting kind of pretty good, into the heavy brush on the other side, where we both heard the noise. Now, I should also say that as soon as we got out of the truck, we realized there was no person there, so my uncle thought it was a big buck, which is why we went chasing after it. But there was nothing there, and we did not hear the buck run off. There were no animal tracks, nothing. We looked around for about a few minutes, gave up, and started walking back to the truck. Still thinking about it, when my uncle and I both heard this ungodly scream, like nothing we'd ever heard before, and a loud crash, like something barreling through the woods close to us. My uncle dropped his binoculars, looking for the missing buck, and drew his tiny pistol. He left his rifle in the truck. We both ran as fast as we could, not slowing down. This thing sounded like a moose running through the trees wearing bowling balls on its feet and body. We sprinted toward the truck, and we see behind us this hair-covered man that's the size of a small giant, swinging wildly, crashing through the trees, screaming and moaning. Anyway, my uncle stops, takes a shot, and this thing stopped in its tracks and disappeared into the brush. Now, I didn't see his face, but from what I could see, this thing was awful. I'm pretty sure I saw a flat nose, deep sunken-in eyes. It was black all over its body, and kind of reminded me of a half-man, half-gorilla, in my opinion. But that's when my memory goes blank, and I remember waking up in the truck bed with my uncle shaking me. Now, what my uncle relayed to me was after he shot it, this thing disappeared, and then he grabbed me, which I apparently fainted from fear, and put me in the back of the truck. I'd only been unconscious for maybe 3 to 4 minutes, but at that point, he pulled out a silver flask and handed it to me, so that he'd seen what it did, and that if I wasn't sipping his magic potion, then no more of the story would be needing to come out for a while. He was pretty adamant about this, so don't ask me many questions about what happened after he shot at him. All I know is up until that point, none of it still really makes sense. But after I took a couple swigs of his magic flask, we got back in the truck and we drove out of there. My uncle, who passed away last year in 2020, refused to ever talk about it again. I think it practicing before our deer season started. Now, I know that what we were doing wasn't necessarily legal, but then again, many people do things that are not legal. We decided that the Grand River National Forest would be a great place to start. It held lots of different varieties of animals, bears, wolves, and the occasional mountain lion. Even a few other sightings have been reported. Being one of the most remote counties, Jackson County is where you want to take your troubles if you don't want anybody else around for miles on end. And I couldn't have chosen a better spot for this occasion. At least, that's what I thought. We had been hiking for hours, trying to find any trace of animals. And surprisingly, even though it was late summer, we weren't seeing much. Now, we were incredibly frustrated. We had been spending hours out here, and we couldn't even find a darn rabbit. We had even been following a small game trail. And right there, as we came around a bend in the trail, everything around us, like the atmosphere, kind of shifted. Things got really quiet, and we could all feel that our hair had raised on our necks, feeling uncomfortable. A few of us mentioned a few words about it, but just continued onwards. Then, all of us at the same time stopped dead in our tracks and stared ahead, as this large shadow off the side of the path began moving. Then, we all saw two big brown eyes staring right back at us from underneath this large bush. We thought it might have belonged to a deer or elk. We knew that even though deer season wasn't yet open, it didn't necessarily mean that anything, because there would be more people out here illegally hunting. But this far out, it didn't make sense. This thing, which we realized was not a deer or elk, stood up. It was clearly crouched down. We were amazed by its height. We could see right there, this was some sort of large hairy man. Now you need to understand something. None of us ever entertained the idea of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. As far as I could recollect, this was never on any of our minds. It seemed a little bit startled and began to move away from us as fast as it could, disappearing into the brush within seconds. We were all shocked, and we followed after it for a bit, trying to get a better look at what this was. As it turned around, it let out this scream, because we knew it was in our pursuit. Right then and there, we all got this bloodlust and wanted to kill it, thinking, if this really was a Bigfoot, we could kill it and have evidence. We never did catch up with him, though, and what happened next makes me regret even looking for him and trying to run after him. We decided after a while to turn around and head back north to our last spawning site, hoping that we would find this thing again as we traveled. As we're walking along the path, hoping we would find this thing, my friend Greg spotted this big patch of dried red blood on the ground. Maybe I forgot to mention, but Greg also shot this thing as it was running away, which is why it screamed. So, sorry if I forgot to include that. The gunshot was still ringing in our ears when the thought crossed our minds. We continued on our way north in search of this thing. We figured that this thing had been bleeding out from the gunshot wound. We would be easier to find now. He would have to travel slower. We were getting pretty excited at this point, thinking we were about to bag this first North American ape or something. But as we came around another curve in the path, we heard something move behind us. We all spun around quickly, and we were looking straight into this thing's eyes again. Bleeding. This thing looked angry. And this time, he wasn't running away from us. Instead, he ran directly toward us. And as he did, we could all have this sense, especially me, that we were going to die. This creature slammed into me, with nearly all of its force knocking me back before I had time to react. It threw me off the trail, 15 feet down into a small ditch, where a bunch of trees and bramble grew. It literally just picked me up off the ground and threw me like I was a rag doll. I was pretty badly injured. Then, he grabs my other friend, wraps his hand around him, and throws him really hard against a tree. He started charging towards Greg next, who fired his gun up at his chest multiple times. Greg began yelling in agony too, when he got slammed against the tree, snapping it right down to its base at about 8 feet tall, and standing right beside where the creature had smacked him with force. This thing, for some reason, was just toying with us, because it barely smacked us and we all went flying. For some reason, it seemed like it was restraining its killing power, which I'm not sure if that was intentional or not. I believe this creature was in fact moving in for the kill, when a couple of similar screams peered off in the distance. I assume now that it was another one of these creatures calling to it. The way this thing responded with a loud scream that hurt our ears, and then taking off in that direction. We were all pretty badly injured, bleeding, several broken bones. I'm surprised that none of us died. We somehow managed to pull our way out of the ditch that we landed in, and made it back to the truck, which took hours, since we were so severely injured. I was convinced that this creature was going to hunt us down and kill us. This thing had broken several of my bones, shattered a rib, and it threw me 15 feet into the tree. We all had to be admitted to the hospital for days with severe cuts, internal bruising, and broken bones. Luckily, we all recovered. I'm barely scratching the surface of the severity of what happened, but I don't got time to go into all the details. Long story short, this thing messed me and my friends up, and had it not been for its buddy calling it, we would have been murdered by this creature. It was a colder night in October. I remember it, and the leaves were beginning to turn, and the air that had crisp, musty smell of autumn. I was sitting at my kitchen table with nothing but a cup of coffee for company when I heard it. This was this low roar, growl, coming from somewhere in the woods behind my house. It sounded like an animal, maybe a large canine, but something about it did not sound right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I shivered as goosebumps broke out all over my skin, despite the warmth of my room. Suddenly, I heard another roar in conjunction with this one, louder and closer. So I jumped up from my chair, ran outside into our backyard to see what this was. I couldn't see anything, just trees. You might think I'm crazy for running out to see what this was, but in that moment, I was more curious than afraid. The noise again grew louder, sounding just beyond the fencing. Then, I heard something crushing through the brush. At first, maybe it could have been a bear. I did not want to go after our chickens. I grabbed a flashlight from the patio table, ran to the chicken coop to check on them, only to discover that they were all locked away, safely, in their little den. Next, I went into the garage, grabbing my husband's shotgun. It sounded like whatever it was really close, and I'm not going to let it get my chickens. It wasn't long before I noticed another movement in the trees, and was able to see something black and hairy. It appeared at first to be a bear, but as I shined my flashlight directly onto it, it walked away. After taking aim, I fired a shot in the direction, hoping maybe the noise would scare it off, but nothing. Then came another roar, louder than before, straight from right behind me. Before I can even register what had happened, this other thing lunged into the darkness at me with open jaws, only to land an attack mere inches away from me when it ran into the end of my shotgun barrel, which pointed straight back at him. As soon as we made eye contact, I fired. This thing went screaming, running off into the woods. I watched it run out of sight, severely injured and bleeding badly. I had shot a Bigfoot. Then another thought flashed through my mind. There's more of them. Should I go into the woods to look for him and hunt him down and kill him, or wait until morning? After agonizing over it for what seemed like forever, I decided to go back inside and get my husband. Together, we could finish the job. Before going back outside, though, I called the police to report that I just shot an animal, a bear in our backyard, only to have them say, "What?" Apparently, they don't receive too many reports of people shooting bears so late at night. They act something else, but they agreed to send somebody. I got back inside, and everything was quiet outside. Somebody had arrived on the scene and was shining their flashlights around to see if they can find anything. They called me over to where they were standing. They had found something. Blood. I explained that a large bear, very aggressive in nature, had tried to get into the property and break into the chicken coop. The officer just kind of looked at me, blankly. And right then, we all three, my husband, the officer, and I, heard this loud scream from back behind the woods, maybe 100 yards back from where the second creature that I shot with the shotgun ran off to. The color from the officer's face joined us so quickly and said, "Ma'am, give me a moment." And he walked off and started radioing something. I couldn't hear, but his expression was panicked and nervous. He walked back over to me and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have my supervisor come here and take over for me. Good luck." And just like that, got in his patrol car and left. And my husband and I weren't really sure what to do, since the only way we can even deal with this with an officer was now shot down. After he left, we went back inside the house, keeping the shotgun ready. The night was full of screams and yells, and our house was pounded on. We didn't feel it was safe to go outside and try and shoot at these things anymore. But in the morning, we woke up to all of our chickens dead. All 18 of them, ripped to pieces. Not shredded, but it looked like somebody had grabbed them, ripped all the heads and just ripped them apart in pieces. It was a bloody mess. And part of their cage, or their chicken coop, was just ripped open, like something large had come through and just tore it. We never paid attention to the whole Bigfoot idea, but we actually moved shortly after that. Easily one of the most terrifying things that I've ever gone through. Luckily, my husband and I now don't deal with anything like this ever again. But do you think this could have been a Sasquatch? I was camping in a very remote part of the Rockies. I was by myself. Being a loner makes you do stupid things like be all alone in the wild with nobody to help you with anything for miles around. But that's just me. The weather had been clear for days, but it was on my last night of camping that an awfully brutal storm swept through the entire area. I had chosen a spot that was out in the open, but the one tree that I camped next to was the tree that fell on my tent, with me on the inside. I was rudely awoken by the sensation of nearly being crushed. That was the true definition of pain in my whole life. The worst kind I've ever felt. It started and burned all at once. No amount of breathing or lying would make it subside. Part of me would have been more than happy to die on the spot, but that didn't happen. The second most painful moment of my life was when the tree began to move for some odd reason. Somebody was handling it, which I couldn't explain for the life of me, since that thing was nearly a full-grown evergreen. Only a monster could have that kind of strength. But my tent was still collapsed on top of me, but just in the right spot, so I wasn't being crushed alive, although smashed and somehow alive. I had no idea who or what was at work outside. I heard some loud grunts and labored breathing, but I didn't see anything until a large hairy hand pulled the tent off of me after the tree was then removed. I think the sharp rise in my blood pressure made my wounds hurt even more. I'd laid there, partly mangled, staring up into the beady eyes of something that looked like a gorilla. The way it looked at me, I could tell it had intelligence in its eyes. It was studying me, as if I was some guinea pig in some 4th grade classroom. It even seemed to understand that I was seriously hurt. However, it was sizing me up for it to be its next meal, or so it looked to be. Apparently, I must have lost consciousness after being in such terrible fear, and nearly after what having happened to me. When I woke up next, I was in the hospital, apparently the ER. Doctor doctors and nurses coming in on regular rounds to check up on me, and they told me I was going to be out of commission for a long time. I also, in the process, lost both my legs, from mid-thigh down. I told them what I knew, or what I thought I knew. They didn't come out and say it, but I'm pretty sure that they're writing the whole thing off as a product of stress. Although they obviously saw that a tree had fallen on my tent and nearly crushed me. I don't know if they know what happened or why it happened. There was no storm. There was no lightning. To say this tree simply fell is silly. Something, some sort of creature from the woods, pushed this tree over on me and checked up on me. I think it knew it was there. I think it was planning to kill me. Why it didn't take me after I lost consciousness, I have no idea. It's one of the freakiest experiences I've ever had out in the woods, ever. And I want to say it's a Bigfoot, but I can't be too sure. But now, I believe that something exists. My uncle called me up, and I could tell he had been drinking, and he was out hunting. He does hunt while intoxicated. How the man hasn't shot anybody yet, for mistaking them for a bear or a buck, I have no idea. His imagination also tends to get the better of him when he drinks, and it doesn't help him that his eyes are going. But beside the point, he's an old man set in his ways, and there's really no way to take his guns away unless he actually hurts someone. So, after getting the call, I took that as a cue that it was time to go make sure that my uncle didn't accidentally shoot any innocent bystander. He rambled on about finding some great furry boulder. That filled me up with fear. It sounded like my uncle was about to pick a fight with a bear. However, it turned out to be much bigger. I arrived at the woods on his property, and I followed the trails to where he described. And there he was with a shotgun, dangerously close to something that was absolutely huge. It had its back turned to us, and it sat on a felled tree, leaning forward, not moving. I dared to get in front of it, and I saw that it had a face that could have passed as a human if it hadn't been covered in hair. And when I say human, I mean incredibly ugly. This thing, for whatever reason, appeared dead, as if it was just left there. We checked the body, or what I would presume to be a body, for any sort of nicks, cuts, or bullet holes. There were none, but this thing stunk to high heaven. I immediately put together a speech in my head that I was going to share this find with my uncle. It was about all the reasons we shouldn't be there at that moment, and why it was a good idea to leave, and to not be around when this thing, or whoever killed it, came for it. I was coming back to my uncle's side when he raised his double-barreled shotgun and gave a whoop and unloaded both barrels into the woods. My face turning white. There were noises in the woods all around us, getting closer. The noise I can only really describe as a whooping sound, if that makes any sense, followed by low groans and moans and grunts. I grabbed my uncle, and we bolted out of there, running for our lives. I don't know what was in the woods that day, but whatever it was, however many of them there were, must have been coming for their kill, which would have been the creature that lay before us, only slightly bigger than a black bear. I, to this day, have no idea what it is we encountered. Part of me would like to think it's a Bigfoot, but why would there be a dead Bigfoot lying in the middle of an opening, with more of them coming to get us or it? None of it makes sense, but one thing still remains. The thought just terrifies me going back to it, and I'd never really go back to my uncle's hunting property if I can. I had to come down with something trying to sleep while I was on my vacation. Realistically, I should have been able to get some extra rest, because I was in my cabin, which resides on a hillside in a pine forest. I won't reveal the location, just in case this story gets out there, and people, for whatever reason, try to look for it. I really don't want any vandals or unwelcome visitors, thank you. Besides that, just as I had fallen asleep, this thundering sound woke me up with a start. It was so noisy that the windows rattled, and having been just woken up so rudely, and being sickly, you can imagine I was not the happiest person in the moment. Throwing on some clothes, I was going to go out there and give whoever it was a piece of my mind. I stepped outside, and what would have been an otherwise perfect summer evening, with the exception that I felt sick, this awful bellowing was coming from up top of the hill, on top of everything. Whoever was making that noise had to have a massive set of lungs. It was terrifying to hear. It sounded like it could have came from a giant. That's when I saw movement directly up ahead of me, up the hill. I then saw enough that I know that this was not human. In fact, it was much bigger than any human. It had arms like a tree limb, and a torso like a trunk. And here's why I'm going to lose a lot of friends. They're going to think I'm crazy. The thing looked every bit like every report of Bigfoot that I've ever heard all my life. The key difference being that I've never heard of a Bigfoot holding onto a tree, lifting his head to the sky. My senses were heightened in the moment, so I was able to take in every little detail. It even kind of had a beard coming from its face, albeit salt and peppery. It was waving in the evening breeze. If this creature wasn't planning to kill something, then I don't know what it was doing, other than yelling its war cry. This terrified me. I took a cue from every monster movie that I've ever been exposed to, and I got the hell out of there, instead of just standing there like an idiot. So, I ran back inside, and I hid. I know, probably not the most dramatic encounter story you've ever received, so do whatever you want with it. But I firmly believe that I saw a Sasquatch up here in the woods. I woke up one morning to the sight of my sheep, just outside my bedroom window. That meant the fence was now down. I had to wonder, what could have been out there to possibly knock down my fence? I come outside to find my entire flock scattered every which way. And because I live out in the country, I guess it's not a huge deal, although there's not a whole lot out here that really pose danger, other than coyotes, mountain lions, and bears. But upon investigation of the fence, the damage done is something you'd expect a car driving through it. This section of fencing wasn't just knocked over. It was mangled, torn out of the ground. I dropped a lot of money that day getting the fence back up, and spent even more in terms of nerves getting all my sheep together. I didn't spend the time with them that I should have, getting used to them and calling them. I tried to put the whole thing behind me and forget about the fact that I just spent about a month's worth of expenses in a single afternoon. I came outside the next morning to the exact same thing, only even more of the fence had been torn down. I was wondering how this happened, twice, without me ever being woken up. That level of damage to a fence should clearly make noise. So, I decided it was time to camp out, and just what was going on. After spending money on getting it fixed a second time, I wasn't going to be able to afford to get it done too many more times. After finally again getting all my sheep together, fortunately, they hadn't wandered too far. I set up a tent with my shotgun. My farmhouse that I had, which was respectably sized, kind of looked like a little dot from where I was. One of those moments where I realized just approaching the sheep pen, very cautiously, I saw the monster reach its arms out, grab hold of the fence, pull it out of the ground, and snap it and rip it, as if it were simply a fence built of toothpicks and string. This giant monster ape thought this must have been a joke. I watched him walk in, the sheep literally terrified and going crazy. It grabbed 2 smaller of my sheep, put them under its arms, and casually walked off. I sat there with my mouth wide open, not even sure what I had to deal with or how I would deal with this problem. Well, turns out not long after that, before I really had a chance to deal with the issue, I ended up getting some severe health problems that I don't want to get into. Long story short, within a few months, I lost my house, foreclosed, and now I don't live there anymore, nor have I in quite some time. But after that night, that was it. I did not lose any more sheep, and I got the fence fixed one last time. Fortunately for me, if the problem came back, it didn't seem to show itself, at least in its destructive nature. Hiking, camping, and hunting are some of my very favorite things to do. I've had some pretty crazy experiences with animals, not behaving like they're supposed to. I've been chased by creatures that are supposedly meant to be docile, and even had a mountain lion walk straight past me. But the story I tell over and over is the time that I saw what I truly believe to be a Sasquatch. I was down in Utah and trying out some ultimate survival skills in order to run a course back home. I feel confident that I'm tough and can deal with most things you might experience out in the wild and know the places to stay the hell away from. I might be a survivalist, but I'm not going to intentionally put myself in the path of a mama bear or a hungry pack of wolves, even with my gun. So I don't go looking for trouble necessarily. I just teach how to survive if trouble finds you. And that day, I truly believe if I hadn't had my wits about me, I would have been Sasquatch dinner for sure. I was nearing the end of the session down there anyway, when I took a deep hike. I had my gun holstered on my belt, just in case. There was just wading through the undergrowth when I am hit by the most god-awful smell. It was terrible. I probably ain't no daisy myself, but this was terrible. Like 1,000 skunks had all set off their stink, and then died. You get the picture. I'm thinking, I'm about to come across some rotting corpses, like a maggot-infested deer, or something, but I can't spot anything on the ground. Then, the trees start shaking, and I could hear this noise. It was like a boom. There's either going to be an earthquake, or something massive is coming through the trees. Then I see it. It doesn't come too close, leaving itself some room, but it is massive and partially hidden by the trees. But I could see this huge mass of what looked to be a body, very resembling of a bear or gorilla. Then, something hit me. I look down, and it's a small rock. The more hit me, and I see this huge creature is pummeling me with rocks in my direction. And that was when I made the connection. Disgusting smells, huge footsteps, and a large body. Now the stones being thrown at me. I've only ever heard of these kinds of things through tales. There's no doubting this was indeed a Bigfoot. Could I have possibly stumbled across its territory or gotten too close to its home? Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to investigate further, as it started throwing bigger and bigger rocks, and one nearly caught me in the face. I thought I'd get the hell out of there before it killed me. Interestingly enough, this being, whatever it was, assuming it was a Bigfoot, could have easily killed me while throwing rocks at me. But it wasn't. It was intentionally missing me, throwing small rocks, as if trying to get my attention to beat it. I truly wonder if it really wanted me out of all, and maybe just maybe, it smelt me first, which is why it was drawn to me. One thing I know for sure now is that Bigfoots are real. When I was just a kid, we had a couple of cousins that lived way out in the countryside. They were full-on proper hillbillies, that was for sure, but with hearts of gold, and I loved visiting them. We played for hours out in the woods back then, and we were actually allowed to be out all day, or until our bellies rumbled for food. The woods were likely full of all sorts of dangerous stuff, but they were the kind of people that you thought you had to learn from your own mistakes, and to not coddle the kids. It was great. Tree climbing, den building, swinging across the river. We'd come home covered in filth and bruises, and my aunt would always just say, "Did you guys have fun?" We'd always tell them we did. So, the day we came running back to the house after having been only out for a couple hours, tears streaking down our faces, and more than down my youngest cousin's leg, they knew something must have happened. We told them that we were playing far in the woods, down by the old creek and the tire swing, and all of a sudden, we smelled this terrible smell, and the first thing we did was blame each other. But it was 100 times worse than even a fart could be. A rustling noise and brush. We turned, and we sat, some sort of half-man, half-gorilla, watching us. It made us scream. This thing was huge, and it was looking at us, high up in the trees. Its face was kind of like a monkey. It was really tall, and covered in dark reddish hair. It opened its mouth and roared, and we all saw just how massive its teeth were. We ran. We were then told by my uncle, he and my older cousin Dale had grabbed their guns and headed back to that exact spot. When they came back, they hadn't found a thing, but the smell, that god-awful stench, lingered, and there was also some footprints, is what appeared. I swear, my uncle looked like he'd actually seen a ghost, pale. He said the footprints were huge, much larger than any of their shoe size, and my uncle is practically a size 13-14. He told us boys that we weren't allowed to go back, ever. In his opinion, we had seen ourselves a squatch. This story takes place when my grandfather was still very much alive. He was the kind of man that spent literally every waking hour of his life working as a rancher, squeezing every dime out of every last second of his time. It paid off. He was able to retire quite handsomely and get a comfortable house in the middle of 17 acres of forest. If that doesn't sound isolated, well, it was. He never did like people, and I was kind of lucky that he liked me. He was every bit of the old man's stereotype that shakes his fist and tells people to go away. More often than not, when he wanted to spend time with me, I ended up being his bouncer. Any stray sounds in the woods surrounding his home was an intruder, and I had to be the one to go on and tell them to get off. It always ended up being a squirrel, or a falling branch, or some other ridiculous, benign, non-human cause. He was kind of psychotic, so I guess you could assume that by this point. But that didn't dissuade him one bit. If he heard it, he had to attack it. His successful retirement hadn't upgraded his diet by much. He still had me over for some stew right out of the can. And when we were eating, we had heard a sound that was on the level of thunder, only it wasn't coming from the sky. It couldn't have been. The skies being perfectly clear. I can vividly remember his face getting red and telling me to go chase the kids off his land. I believe that there was something to this time, because whatever that sound was, it was deafening. I was pretty apprehensive in going out to take care of this problem. All I had was a revolver that he had gifted me when I was 16. It was better than nothing, but still. I entered a clearing in the woods where I found the source of the clamor. I could scarcely believe my eyes, and it was kind of a miracle that I didn't mess myself on the spot. Nothing in all my years could have prepped me for what I saw. Ever heard of a Bigfoot? I mean, who hasn't by now? But have you ever heard of a snowy white albino Bigfoot? Maybe that's a little new, at least for me. Heard of a snowy white Bigfoot having a violent encounter with other wildlife? It might sound like something out of a novel, but that's what I was seeing. This thing was huge, like you'd expect, and for some reason, a group of timber wolves had decided to pick a fight, and this big white Bigfoot, assuming that's what it was, grabbed one wolf and tore it in half like it was nothing. The other one was grabbed and nearly choked to death. It was terrifying. I was horrified, but they weren't discouraged, and they kept attacking. Then, this thing grabbed a third wolf and grabbed it by the legs and slammed it up against the tree, nearly breaking its back, as if it were a dead rabbit. I ran, for fear of my own life and safety. Then, I had to tell my grandfather that there was this thing, a Bigfoot, wrecking several timber wolves. He reacted about the way you'd expect. His eyes got wide, and he waited for me to tell him more. But he might not have believed me right then and there. He called me a few years later to tell me that he saw a Bigfoot, a white one, that I told him about before. I know there are more terrifying things than a Bigfoot, but the entire experience and visual of it all left me with a sense of smallness. If wolves are nothing more than field mice in the eyes of some things on Earth, then what are mere men? I guess I shouldn't be so shaken up over seeing things in this new perspective, but I'd spent my life seeing men in a place in the universe that they apparently didn't really occupy. It's really done something to me. It's changed me, and not in a good way. This is hands down one of the scariest encounters I've ever seen in my life, and it tells me that we are definitely not on top of the food chain anymore. While I was growing up, my best friend was a border collie. We named her Cindy. Cindy was as wild as you would expect the breed to be, and if you know anything about border collies, well, it shouldn't be a surprise. She was the usual black and white, and even though we didn't have any sheep, since they're amazing sheep-herding dogs, she behaved every bit like a sheepdog toward me. I was the livestock that she had to keep corralled, so it was something of a game between her and I to just see how far I could get before her instincts kick in, and she had to come collect me, or whatever it was she was doing in her brain. At the time, we lived at the edge of an expansive pine forest deep in Nebraska. There was no shortage of timber for us to roam around in. For obvious reasons, my parents preferred that I did not go into the woods by myself. I mean, I was only 7 at the time. But as any parent of a child of 7 years of age, children exist only to push whatever boundary is in front of them, much to the dismay of creatures like parrots and even sheepdogs. If you're hearing this story on a certain Cryptid Encounter podcast, then you know I have a story for you that didn't end well. It was one of those getaways that should not have happened. My parents were not around. Their friends were around, and so was Cindy. Plus, they had sternly charged me not to run off into the woods. So, with that many sets of eyes, I shouldn't have been able to get away undetected. Somehow I did. As soon as I sensed a window of opportunity, I booked it to see how far I could get before Cindy came looking. I had already long forgotten about the adults. I got a pretty good head start, and then I began to get lost. No adults and no dog came looking. I lost my bearings, and I couldn't find my way back at the time. So, I entered into a very small clearing, where there was a small pond. I was enchanted to the point that I forgot about getting back. Something moved in the shadows of the trees, was when I was confronted by the biggest living thing I had ever seen or known in my life. It resembled a monkey, but was very man-like in appearance. I guess I used to call it a mountain monkey, if that makes sense. I wasn't entirely sure if I should be afraid or fascinated. The thing's face was a mixture of curiosity and puzzlement, and yet I could tell it seemed to be devoid of any friendliness. Just as it was reaching one hand, Cindy appeared, and she put herself between me and this giant monkey thing, and began barking like crazy, her hackles raised, and her teeth bared. This only fascinated this creature even more, or this monster, whatever it was. The creature just reached out toward its hand and tried to grab onto Cindy. But that's when I was truly terrified, because it somehow grabbed her and then choked her to death. And when I mean choked her, I don't mean in a traditional sense. It literally grabbed her and crushed her like she was a Coke can. That's when I panicked and fled, crying hysterically, screaming. I slammed into my father, who was completely livid. He wasn't sure if he should be happy to see me or be full of rage. After everything calmed down, the question was naturally raised as to the whereabouts of Cindy. At 7 years of age, I tried to tell them as best I could, with my very limited vocabulary, that this giant monkey man killed her. But they wouldn't understand what I meant for a very long time. A lot of people say they have had a hard time shooting Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever, when they see it, because it just looks far too human. I have a feeling that if I ever encountered it again, and I'm armed, I would have zero problems taking revenge and taking a shot right between the eyes. The sound of my dog struggling for its life while it was being crushed alive is now this vivid traumatic memory in my mind, and will forever be. My parents, however, at the time, were convinced I saw a bear that killed Cindy. How wrong they were. In late high school, 1990, a group of my friends drove out to Livermore, California, down Arroyo Road. The time of the year was likely spring or summer, as I do not remember it being cold. At the end of Arroyo at the time, or off of a turnoff, was a pumping station for the local reservoir. We parked in the street. The reason for this trip was a trek to the ruins of a former mental hospital. Unclear if there was a more direct route, but Arroyo Road was desolate and rarely ever used at that point. We thought it would be fun and had attempted this journey before, but unfortunately, were never successful. I was driving one of the two cars, and it was after dark. The other driver and I got out of the cars and turned towards the hillside behind us. I was shining a flashlight along the hill, and almost immediately noticed a tall, furry brown creature walking on two legs from left to right for about 30 to 40 feet. This was approximately 40 feet away, and the other driver was next to me, and I asked, "Are you seeing what I am?" I couldn't finish the sentence before he eagerly replied, "Yes, I am." I continued on shining the light on the creature as it moved to the right, and then started up the hillside before disappearing. As the others were getting out of the car, the other driver and I quickly discussed that we wouldn't mention this to the others, because it would only scare them. We gathered all the flashlights and proceeded up the hill behind the cars. I had been part of 3 or 4 previous trips to the same location, and had never been scared before like I was that same night. Instead of shining the light ahead, I was constantly shining it behind and around us, looking for that same creature. I was, and am still convinced, that what I saw was a Bigfoot. So was the other driver. We later shared with the group, who dismissed our sighting as a bear or some other creature. Well, I'm here to tell you, it was not a bear. It was tall, dark brown, and clearly and visibly walked too comfortably substance that night. About 10 years later, I did some research on the internet and recall finding out that there had been other sightings around Livermore previously. I tried to find those details again, but was not successful. This occurred in James City County, Virginia. My two boys, ex-husband and I, were heading back to our hotel from dinner in Williamsburg on the evening of October 22nd, 2020. I took a left turn onto East Rochambeau Drive, which parallels with Interstate 64. At the time, it was a clear night, dark, and right around 9 p.m. I know for sure that it was after 8:50 p.m., and right before 9, I was hoping to get back to watch the 9 p.m. debate. My son made a comment about my speed, and I pointed out a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit sign as we passed it. I rounded a corner, and we saw a brief, small glitter, which led my eye to see movement. I quickly could tell that it was upright, a bipedal figure. As it walked quickly from right to left, I immediately could see that it walked just like a human, but was extremely broad and very huge. The arms and upper thighs were so big that I could see the outline of muscles. The figure was blacker than black, almost resembling an enormous shadow figure, but much more solid. My lights only revealed more blackness, no clothing, just one wholesome, solid figure. I could see from the middle of the face and most of the legs. I saw no features, as it was walking, only showing its side to me. It moved very quickly and smoothly. I could not see its feet or the top of the head. It happened so quickly, in fact, that I didn't even have time to say look to my family who was with me. As soon as it stepped on the side, I immediately said, "What was that?" I was curious as to where it went, and as I passed the area, I could clearly see that it went into the woods. It's important to know there were no cars, people, or anything else on the road. There was one little house further down the road that did have a front porch light on. I kept trying to understand the distance from my car to the area that it walked in the woods, trying to understand the height, but what I saw was huge. No way any human could be as huge, tall, or that broad. Again, it was black, so black that my lights didn't even reveal any details, which is odd. My children were completely freaked out, so I did not stop. I've since returned twice to the area to look at that road and also surroundings. It's important to note that the road was dark and the figure was black, so black that I could easily see the shape in walking. Even though there was a quick small light glimmer that drew my attention, which I could then make out this enormous figure, it did not turn to look at our car. I'm still searching to see if there's other stories. I've gone back to this location 2 different times to observe the land, distance, and trying to determine the height and where it was coming from and why it might have been traveling in that area. Back in February of 2011, I was traveling down Highway 95 between Potlatch, Idaho and Tenst, Idaho, right around midnight and somewhere between 9 and 2 a.m. It was all wooded pasture off to the right side of the highway and open grass pasture and creek on the left, which is also the driver's side of the highway. I was busy driving into a cove before a wide-ganned private road when approximately about 50 feet in front of me, I saw a very large, dark form walk straight across the highway, right to left. I assumed at the time it was a human, so I slowed to a full stop in the middle of the highway, which at the time was empty, both directions, except for me. It was at this point that I realized that I could not see this person off the side of the highway or out in the grass pasture to my left. I did indeed have my high beams on, this event that I continually checked my rearview mirror, expecting to see something horrible or have something horrible happen to me. Once I got home, I bolted into the house, turned on every light, and woke up my entire family. They all just kind of laughed it off, but my dog crawled up into my lap and whined and cried at me and wouldn't leave my side for some strange reason. I didn't sleep at all that night, and even tried avoiding driving that highway so late. It wasn't until later that I really started to process the details of what happened. I realized that I saw somebody, very distinctly bipedal, walk across the highway. There was no mistaking that detail. I can still remember the walking motion of the legs and the slight swinging motion of the arms. I also realized that while I had my high beams on the figure, it was completely and utterly black. It was weird not to have any reflection from clothing, shoes, or even a shadow thrown onto the highway. The other thing that very much bothered me was that I never took my eyes off what happened. That somewhere between the figure walking across the highway and walking off the side, it disappeared. I definitely should have been able to see something walking down the side of the ditch or into the pasture, but it was empty. It took me quite some time to come to terms with what happened, and even longer before I finally admitted to myself that it may have indeed been a Sasquatch-related sighting. In fact, I've recently been compelled to report this specific sighting due to the fact that recently, a woman claimed to have seen a Sasquatch right before hitting a deer in almost the exact same area in a similar time frame. But she's been made into a joke by the local news. Go figure. I don't know if she actually did see one, but I find it a very, very odd coincidence that it happened in that same area of highway and in the same time frame. Maybe there's something there. There are other stories, though. I guess the area is rife with people who talk behind their hands about Sasquatch sightings, but rarely ever go public. I'm not surprised. In fact, recently, in March, one woman reported seeing a Sasquatch before hitting a deer in the same location that I had my experience years before. A very different lady than the one I just mentioned. There's more happening here than you would imagine. At the time of this sighting, I was 17 years old, and the year was 1981. A very different time than today. No cell phones, no devices to have in front of your face, and nothing but forcible human contact. A much better time, but at that young tender age, my life would be forever changed when I saw something in the woods that at the time I could not explain, but would only further accept as what I would call a Bigfoot. At the time, I was out exploring in the backwoods, probably looking for arrowheads or anything that would interest a 17-year-old boy. I think I was just trying to find something to do, to avoid going back home to my abusive, alcoholic father. Anything to keep me out of the house. The woods at the time were very much my safe spot, until this happened, and made me even more uncomfortable being in either location, home or forest. I was messing with a stick, probably trying to carve a spear, if I can recall correctly, when I looked up and noticed a strange face looking at me from the tree line. At first, I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but then it moved, as if it was curiously watching me. That's when I realized this was not a person, but a thing. Some strange unidentifiable animal. That's when I then realized that this animal was built like a linebacker, and easily 8 to 9 feet tall, covered in thick, brown, woolly hair. Its face looked very much like a human. A large nose, just like ours, a very strong brow line, and very thin lips. The eyes were dark, and I couldn't exactly make out what they were. But it smiled at me, and observed me. I was very intrigued, as much as I was scared. But something told me, deep in my gut, that this was dangerous. Then, as it continued to stare at me, I began to get the sensation that I was in trouble. That fight or flight sense that tells you are in grave danger. And then I began to hear rustling from all around me, and I knew I was not alone. I knew, in that moment, I was surrounded. Then, as soon as I looked back to this creature from looking around me, it was gone, and I heard more rustling from all around me. There were multiple of these things, and they were circling me, getting closer. I took out of there like a bat out of hell, and I dealt with my abusive drunken father the rest of that day, week, even months, not going back to that same spot in the woods, for fear of whatever that thing was. Fast forward 10 years to around 91, 92, and I learned from some friends that I'd acquired recently at the time that my story was that of a Bigfoot. Nothing will end your career as a park ranger faster than failing to respond appropriately to a fire. And, often enough, they don't care if you're caught in it, time or not. The fact that there was a fire and you were nearby can be grounds for dismissal if your superiors are in a foul enough mood. It was, after all, the dry season at the park that I serve at. We were hearing warnings almost daily at how conditions were perfect for a massive conflagration. All of us were on edge at the time, especially me. I was at the point that I was having nightmares about the entire place catching fire, and then it being blamed on me. I almost began having heart palpitations when I saw legitimate fires that were properly contained and cared for. I was making my rounds one afternoon on a day when the park was all but completely empty. So, I pulled up to a spot that had been clearly made to have a barbecue pit. There was a fire in the pit, and it was extending well beyond the stone circle. Nobody was around. The adrenaline that I felt in that moment was terrifying. I was out of the squad car in a heartbeat, charging over to see what I could do to contain the fire, which, as of yet, had not gotten out of hand. As soon as I was standing over the stone circle, though, the fire was gone. This daunted me for only a half second. I then looked around, and I saw that the fire had somehow moved from the fire pit to the prairie grass that the picnic site was carved out of. I began panicking. I may or may not have had a slight bowel movement along with it. I ran in circles for about a half a minute before I made a mad dash at the flames to try and stomp them out. And then the flames weren't there anymore. They were further away, at the edge of the forest that bordered the prairie grass. I checked myself for signs that I wasn't having a stroke or a heart attack. I looked at the immediate area that I was standing in. No sign of having been fire. No burnt grass, ashes, smell of smoke, or any other sign. I gazed at the fire for a moment from where I stood, and it looked every bit like a real fire. I could see the smoke. I could even hear the crackling of the flames. My panic was subsiding under the strangeness of the whole situation, and I marched towards the flames and kept my eyes on them. When I was roughly 15 paces away, they disappeared. When I arrived at the spot, I could see the fire much deeper in the forest. I then felt a paranoia that defied description, but I didn't dare turn my back, so I chased it wherever the fire would disappear and reappear. It was leading me in a straight line, a single direction. I arrived at the remains of a campsite that had been set up to remain hidden. It was located in tall brush, behind a bunch of very thick, dense shrubbery, and even sharp thorns. The difficulty of moving through it made me want to turn back, but it was one of those things where I had come this far. There was no use in turning back now. I began examining the campsite terrifying than the phantom fire I was experiencing. A blue tarp full of surgical instruments that had been buried. After looking at them closer, they were stained with old blood. This shook me. I knew there was something else nearby that I did not want to find, but I did. Also, wrapped up in another separate tarp and buried in a shallow grave were two bodies. It was hard to tell who or what they were, because the bodies had been partially burned. My guess was that whoever tried to dispose of them by burning them found out that it wasn't as easy as they thought it could be. So they wrapped them up and tried to bury them hastily. After the police got involved and forensics had their way, they determined it was a boy who had been kidnapped from an hour away and a girl also from about 3 hours away. The two victims had no ties to each other, which adds to the sickening twist to the entire thing. Just wanted to give you my 2 cents, since I used to be a ranger. I have no idea what happened, because there was a discovery to the aftermath. But let me explain. I was having a coffee break near one of the pavilions in my park. Being entirely by myself, or so I thought at the time, I jumped when an older woman tapped on the glass of my driver's side door. After rolling it down and asking her if there's anything I could do to help, she just stared at me blankly, wondering if she was okay. I began to open my door to step out and help her, and she collapsed right there on the ground. I freaked, began doing CPR. The center of her shirt had been torn off. All there was a hole in her ribcage, where her heart appeared to have been removed. I radioed the whole thing in. People showed up to take care of the body and investigate. That one actually was a huge investigation, and I've never heard another word about it. I've been told to be quiet about it, and people aren't really speaking about it in my field and higher-ups. It doesn't even make sense, and I know it's a really strange, bizarre story to happen. I don't even really know how to explain it, but for whatever reason in this job field, it appears that we run into all sorts of stuff that just doesn't make sense. I'm not sure if you're aware of all the bizarre and strange happenings of things that go on in the forest service industry. It's not exactly the most entertaining job in the world, and has many slower moments throughout the day. But there are some times that you just get chilled to the bone. A perfect example of this is back in my early 20s when I was interning for the first few years. We had a very interesting situation. Before I go any further, my beliefs are pretty firm. That is, I don't really believe in much. Anything like Bigfoot, fairies, monsters under the bed. I don't believe in any of that stuff. But this job has made me question things that I normally shouldn't question. At the time, I had been working in my position for around 7 months when we got a call about campers complaining, frantic and hysteric. They said something about a giant ape breaking through their camp and stealing one of their phones. Naturally, we showed up there, trying to calm them down, but they were in complete hysterics. Well, police got involved and it turned into a full investigation, and we, including me, was a part of a full-on search and rescue for the quote-unquote missing persons, which was a young girl in her late teens that apparently this large gorilla took, or so they described. Now, when they mentioned that, my first thought was Bigfoot, but I don't really believe in that, so I kind of just chalked it up to maybe they had gotten too drunk and partied the night before, and perhaps she wandered off and got lost. But after spending some time with the campers, they were pretty clean and sober. No drugs, no alcohol, just a couple of good kids my age, just partying and enjoying themselves up in the woods. And when I say partying, I'm not talking drugs and alcohol. I'm talking a double date. They were just enjoying their time together, hiking, and being out in nature alone. Their story was that they were camping quietly, and in the middle of the night, one of these large gorilla creatures came to their tent, thrashed around when they went to go see what was going on. This creature grabbed a hold of the youngest girl of the group, took her, and ran off with her. Now, I don't know exactly what that looks like. This is just their reiteration to us, the Rangers, of what happened. Keep in mind, their body language, complete and total fear, everything, was showing us they were in complete and total terror. There's no way they were making this up. If they were the world's best actors and actresses. So, like I said, the police came, took statements, got heavily involved, and a search and rescue party began for a few days. Well, unfortunately, we found no trace of the missing girl, nor could our dogs even get a scent trail. But we found a piece of her tattered clothing about 4 miles away from her camp location, in the complete opposite direction of the park, deeper in the woods, where it's pretty thick, and there aren't even any trails around. It was a piece of her tattered clothing, matched via DNA. We have no other conclusive evidence besides that. So, I'm not sure if my hypothesis of her getting drunk and wandering off really matched up at this point, once I found that out. After some time, I can't remember exactly at what point we stopped, but the search was given up on, and she was marked as missing and never found. To be honest, that's a case that still sits in my mind a lot. I still wonder what happened to her, and where she went, if anything. Or did something really come and take her? This strange gorilla creature they claim to have saw, that terrorized and rampaged through their camp. While the case is very disturbing in its own right, due to the situation in the story, it's just one of many people like us in the Forest Service have to deal with, more than we'd like to. I've been wanting to write you in for a while, and tell you my story, the one that stands out to me the most, of a very creepy situation that happened when I was serving as a ranger many, many years back. I'd say roughly 7 or 8 now. This takes us back to about summer of 2013. I won't tell you the state or the park. I prefer to keep that private. I don't want any connections to my name to this in any way. After all, you never know with the internet. But I can say it's in the Midwestern area of the United States, closer to the Great Lakes. But that's as much as I'll release. There was talk at the time of my colleagues finding nooses around the park, all around, not just one. Thankfully, they were empty, but they all appeared to be made from the same rope, tied the exact same way, and it appeared to be that somebody had made a multitude of these things and gone around and hung them up all throughout the park. I thought the whole thing was weird, but they were taken down shortly thereafter. Then a few more months passed, and we got into very, very late summer, late August, early September. That's when I began hearing talks about it. I thought my colleagues were just joking, pulling my leg, thinking that whole thing again, even though I did believe them back in the spring when they were seeing it. But this sudden revival of these nooses, it was very, very off-putting. That is, until I found them myself. I found about 7 of them, all in different areas of the parks, and the most disturbing, places that people can't even get to easily. Places that are far off trail, several miles. Just strange stuff. When we compared many of the nooses side by side, they were the exact same rope material, tied the exact same